Hello and welcome to the Unsung Sport podcast, the podcast that takes you behind the sports you love. Today I'm joined by Hashim Ali, Head of Academy Medicine and First Team Support at Colchester United. Thanks very much for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me on. It's a massive pleasure. I've never actually done a podcast before.
No, same. So, it's a new experience for us both.
Yeah, it'll be good. I'll be excited to watch this back, actually, see my performance, bit of analysis.
Yeah, that's a new job, is it? Analysis.
Yeah.
Well, thanks so much for coming in. Be great to hear more about your role. And I guess that head of medicine role isn't one that you see very often, if at all. So it'd be great to find out what you do on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, I think the head of medicine role in general is actually quite common amongst clubs. So you'll have like a head of sports science and medicine, or a head of medicine that just looks after the medical parts of football clubs. But I think the way that my role is unique is it's a hybrid role where I'm involved heavily in the academy and heavily in the first team.
Yeah.
And so it's a bit of a demanding role where, on any one day I could be seeing the club captain in the morning and then one of the newly signed under nines sort of later on in the day. So it's one that definitely demands a lot of adaptability, but it's a really good role to experience everything that you can ever sort of come across at a club.
And a role like that, you're spread pretty thin, so you must have a real passion for football or for sport. Where did that passion come from?
Yeah, from a young age, really. Strange, actually, because I'm actually the only person in my family that watches football.
All right, okay.
So parents don't watch it. My brother's not really interested in it at all. It's just me, really. But I always liked it growing up. And yeah, I remember sort of growing up, I never really, we never had any Sky or anything like that at home growing up. Mm-hmm. But I remember like when I was in the younger years at school, like I remember a really distinct memory. I think I must have been in year 3. And this is like when I'm first starting to learn about the school football team and bits like that. And I'm thinking they're famous. Like I'm thinking everyone who's playing in the school football team is famous.
Right.
And they had like a school football match on that night. And I've gone home and I'm going through the 5 channels that we have on TV, waiting for the game to come on, like the school football game to come on BBC 2. But yeah, that's the passion I had. Like I really wanted to watch it.
And did you make the school team in the end?
Yeah, I did make the school team in year 5.
Yeah.
It wasn't a very good school team. That's why I made it.
All right, okay. So he was never going to be a pro?
No, not that I. Well, not that I know. No one's ever told me that.
Yeah. Do you think that? I think we all think we could have made it if it wasn't for an injury or something.
Yeah, I reckon. No, I've touched wood. I've never had an injury.
Yeah.
And that's why I didn't make it.
Okay. And obviously now you're looking after injuries at a professional level. So, I guess that talking through the types of injuries that you have, I know there's all different types, but there's a lot of talk at the moment around head injuries and things like that. How important is that now, and how do you manage it within a club? Yeah,
so there's a lot of research at the minute going into repeated head trauma. So there's a charity at the minute, I think it's called Head for Change, and it's run by a lad who was a rugby player. He was a professional rugby player, and also I think the wife of somebody who used to be an ex-professional footballer or rugby player. I'm not 100% certain, but
yeah,
they both suffer from dementia as a result of their professional sporting careers. So there's a lot of research going into it, and the FA are sort of on board with it a little bit to limit the amount of heading that goes on in sport at the minute.
Yeah.
So the FA guidelines at the minute are actually no heading for any players that are in primary school.
Right, okay.
And then as you go up the years, the recommended heading increases. So you have, for example, up to, I think, 15 is 1 session a week where heading's allowed. And I think it's five headers. And then beyond that, it's another 1 session a week, but you're allowed 10 headers. And they recommend that you sort of underinflate the balls a little bit to make it the lowest limit that you're allowed and bits like that, literally just to protect the potential effects long term.
Yeah.
And the other side of it is concussion injuries. And they are a massive, massive part of football at the minute. There's really stringent guidelines for anyone that's suspected to have any form of concussion at all. And the rule's pretty simple, actually. If you're in doubt of it, they've got to sit out.
Okay.
So even if we have baseline tests, essentially, so every player will be baselined, and they need to be baselined once every 2 years.
Okay.
So you have a baseline test that they go through, and you test their cognition and their recall and their balance and loads of orientation and bits like that. And it doesn't matter how high they score, you just need what their baseline is.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
And then suppose they get a bad knock or they land from a header in a bad way, you'd go on and sort of ask simple pitch questions, and then when you get an opportunity, you're going through that whole test again, and you're seeing how far off they are off baseline. And even if their character is slightly off what you're used to,
right,
that would be enough for you to say, I'm not risking it, and you have a concussion. And then that would be enough in some cases. If you don't have a doctor that's experienced in concussion and dealing with them, that would be enough to sometimes sideline a player for 3 weeks.
Wow, 3 weeks. How does that, I'm not saying for Colchester, but just in general, if it's like Haaland's not a good example because City have so many good players, but if it's your star player in a team, is there, I mean, there's got to be that, from a manager's point of view, you need this player, you're going for promotion, you're avoiding relegation, you must be trying to push back on that. I mean, how can that happen?
I think a concussion is probably one of the hardest injuries to explain to player and manager, because by day 2 or day 3, the player can look like they're completely asymptomatic.
Mm-hmm.
But we need to be so careful because this is essentially a brain injury. When the concussion happens, the brain hits the wall of your skull. And we need to be so careful because symptoms can often take longer to show up. So there are instances where a concussion, he's absolutely fine in front of you, and then within 2 days, he's vomited out of nowhere.
Right.
But it's actually to do with the concussion. So it's really, really difficult when you get to a point in it where he's back to baseline, but you need to go through all the steps to make sure he's actually safe to return into normal training. So it's a graduated return. So he needs to start off with really light exercise, and then you'd sort of increase it to a limited amount of time and a limited level of heart activity. And then you want to increase it to where he's doing actually more movements and it's more football-based drills, and then returning to non-contact training and then returning to contact training. So you've got to go through all these steps before you can actually say he's safe to play.
Wow.
And both manager and player will find it really, really frustrating. And I've had an instance where we've had a player who was sort of borderline academy first team, and he was really close to sort of making it into the first team squad. He's picked up a concussion in the academy game.
Right.
His character was just off, and some of his scores were just off baseline. And so diagnosed him with a concussion, and he was fuming. He was absolutely fuming. He was ready to kill me because that diagnosis stopped him from being involved with the first team. So what he's done that night is he's gone home, he's turned his PlayStation on, he's put on UFC. He has made a character that looks like me.
Jeez.
He has knocked me out in UFC, and he has filmed it and said, "Who has got a concussion now?" And he has sent it to me.
That sounds a bit extreme.
Yeah, that is what happened, I promise you.
Wow.
But yeah, it's a really, really difficult sort of injury to explain because they appear to be perfectly normal.
Yeah.
But ultimately, we're looking at long-term health. But equally, in some clubs, we have doctors that are experienced in dealing with concussion. And so when we have all the facilities and things that we need in place for that, we can go through an enhanced protocol, which is supervised at every single stage, cleared by the club doctor, and they can return in 7 days. So they're probably still likely to miss a game, but with the correct supervision and the correct staffing, you can go from 21 to 7. So yeah, it really, really depends on the club and the staffing that you have in place and how old the player is and their symptoms and loads and loads of different bits. But yeah, there is a little bit of a leeway.
Yeah. Okay. Great. So, and obviously, I know that obviously you're at a professional club, but these kind of injuries happen in non-league or Sunday league football. How could a manager or player kind of identify that? I mean, that must be really hard.
It's based off the character of the player, so knowing what the player is generally like. Sometimes you can have a really, really nice player and they become concussed and suddenly they're really aggressive.
Right.
Or you can have an aggressive player that becomes concussed and then they're really calm. And that's a really big indication. And that's actually part of that assessment. It's called a SCAT test. And then that assessment is used sort of alongside the clinical judgment. It's genuinely just a sort of questionnaire that you go through with a player, maybe takes 20 minutes or so.
Yeah.
But it's a massive, massive thing to identify because, like I say, they can seem completely normal. And then you can ask them something like, I've had some crazy instances actually with concussions now that you mention it. I've had a player this year think we're in 2021.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
And then there's like word recall where it's a set number of words and they just have to repeat it back to you. And I've had some crazy words being mentioned back in that. So that baseline really gives you a lot to go off because it's the exact same test and you're just doing it, both before and after.
Yeah.
But you see big differences. So even in non-league, that's really the way to go.
Okay. Do you think many non-league clubs would know that? Because I've been at around non-league clubs and literally they'd probably have a first aid box, which is 20 quid off Amazon and that's kind of their medical kit.
Yeah.
Like it's a world apart, I know, but
no, they don't know that.
No, this is a problem.
And
okay,
I think even if they did do that,
yeah,
I don't think a lot of clubs would do it because if it's 20 minutes per player, and say you have a squad of a minimum of 16, it's going to take you hours to get through everybody. And then whoever you have as a physio is only going to be working with you the Tuesday, Thursday and the game day.
Yeah, it can be part-time or volunteer if anything, yeah.
So they're probably going to be busy looking after the injuries at that time. Really, it needs to be done pre-season. But how many clubs actually do it? Probably not a lot.
Yeah. Okay. Definitely a cautionary tale for many out there. And so another one as well, and I can't remember the name of it. I watched a documentary the other night on kind of heart screenings and I know there's a few out there. In February, Moremba pops up in a few of them. Obviously, that's one of the most famous cases. Yeah. But what's those kind of protocols for heart screening now as well? Because again, I know that a couple of young players have died recently at non-league level, and
so it's a lot more. It's a lot more in the news recently, and it's unclear at the minute whether these deaths have actually increased or whether we're just more aware of it because it's more sort of in the news. But you look at Ericsson and Charlie White not too long ago as well. Mm-hmm. The protocol is that everybody needs to have cardiac screening if you're in a professional footballing environment, and that starts from the age of 15. So if you're in an academy that belongs to a professional club, you need to be screened at 15, then again at 17, and again at 19, and again at 21. So 4 years. That is a Premier League rule. And that's sort of across the Premier League and the EFL. And then after that, every player should have screening every 2 years. Yeah. As far as I'm in the EFL, as far as I'm aware. It's a really difficult thing to organise. The FA, to be fair, are really good on helping on it. But there are set providers that the FA will accept and any other provider they won't accept. So they have a set list and you need to go to one of the people on that list for them to approve of the cardiac screening that you've had. So at 15, they start off with just like a normal ECG that probably most people would have had. Mm-hmm. Then at 17, they have an ECG and a ultrasound as well, so an echo. and then they go ECG and ECG and ECG again. And what we're looking to pick up is any abnormalities. And a really common one of picking up is an athletic mutation of the heart.
Okay.
So as you're playing more and more football, your heart starts to athletically develop. And it's a really common thing to be picked up. And as soon as that gets picked up, they then need to clear other heart conditions that might present similarly. So hypertrophic cardiomyopathy is a really big, it's a big condition, and it's probably one of the more common conditions in football, albeit still really rare.
Mm-hmm.
And people who have that condition are just at a little bit of a higher risk of suffering from a sudden cardiac arrest. And it is generally a more common condition in those of an African genetic background.
Mm-hmm. All right.
So we'll have players along the line where they sort of suspect it, and we go and do extra tests, and the extra tests will be like a exercise ECG, where they're on a bike or they're on a treadmill, and you need to get their heart rate up to a certain level, and they're monitoring it the whole time. And then they'll go through a heart MRI to see how the heart is functioning through all the different axes. And then they will put a 24-hour monitor on them and train. And then that monitor will get sent back, and they'll look through the whole 24 hours, see for any abnormalities. Then you're in for a consultation, and then you're given the advice at the end of that. Some players have that elevated risk, or might actually even have the HOCM, the hypertrophic cardiomyopathy.
Mm-hmm.
And some of those are just a little bit slightly elevated risk, but that elevated risk is enough for them to say they're not allowed to train unless there is somebody pitch side who is fully trained in leading cardiac resuscitation.
Right, okay.
So straight away the whole club needs to be aware of that player, because if that player suddenly goes down, we need to think that it's the worst case scenario.
Mm-hmm.
We need to think that this is a cardiac arrest. So we need to go on sort of all guns blazing. So you think of the way Eriksen went down in the World Cup, that is straight away everyone's on with emergency equipment, and we're looking at a cardiac resus and bits like that. Obviously, if they go down and they're holding their ankle, you can use clinical judgment to say that's probably not it. But pre-game, if you have a player like that, you will make everyone aware. So paramedics will be aware, the other team will be aware. Everyone that's sort of medically responsible for anything in that game will be aware that we have a player who's at a slightly elevated risk of this. Everyone will have the squad number. If they're going down in a really abnormal way, everyone's on.
So do you think people knew? Do you think Eriksen, like the team knew that Eriksen had, obviously when he had that, it was quite quick. So do you think they were aware?
I think that's really difficult to say, to be fair. That if the club would have known if there was something there. As far as I'm aware, he didn't have anything pre that game.
Right.
But if there was something there, everyone would have known. For the World Cup, what they do is they'll send the medical team out to the country pre-tournament. They'll send all the medical team out to the country. They'll go around to the different stadiums, look at how everything is set up so they can understand what the emergency action plan is. And then they will go from the stadium to the hospitals that are closest to that emergency action plan. So it's all really, really well set up for situations like that at the big tournaments like the Euros and the World Cups and bits like that. But in terms of if they knew pre, they probably did if something was picked up. But if nothing, I don't think anything was picked up before that. I think he was healthy and clear.
Yeah. And I suppose those screenings, they're not 100% as well. I guess they can miss things.
Yeah. I hope we haven't.
Yeah. No, I mean, I was saying in the documentary, I know that they said that, again, they have different doctors on, and some say they're definitely worth doing, but they're not 100%.
Yeah. So we've had instances where, like I say, a player might present like they have a cardiac condition, and we end up testing both their parents as well, because it's usually a genetic thing. So we end up testing both their parents because we need to confirm that it is that. We end up testing both their parents, and we go through the exercise ECG, and we go through X, Y, and Z. But the consultants that are used by the FA understand that it's quite rare anyway.
Yeah.
You know, and I've yet to. There is an instance where a player we were warned that he needs to stop playing with immediate effect.
Right. Okay.
Because of a cardiac condition. That was then reversed within a year.
Okay.
That decision was then reversed. So sometimes what happened then is we caught the player essentially in a period of his growth where his heart was changing anyway, and his heart was developing and growing. And because we caught that one snapshot, it looked like there was a condition.
Yeah.
9 months down the line, we've gone for another scan and more reports, and it seemed healthy. And then we've gone to the top dog in the country just to make sure, because you're almost playing with someone's life.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
And we've gone to top dog, Professor Sanjay Sharma, who deals with most of the Premier League players really on a cardiac level, who thankfully has cleared him to return to play. So there are definitely instances where they will say, look, this is a life or death situation, which is why it's so important. But yeah, I reckon that's probably one of the situations you're talking about where someone can potentially, it can be a false positive almost.
Yeah, and there's also, again, last thing from this documentary, but there was also, they were saying that there was a player in France who actually had a heart defibrillator fitted. I never heard of that. You hear a pacemaker, but I'd never heard of an actual defibrillator.
Yeah, so essentially they implant like a little one, and as soon as it detects atrial fibrillation or another type of abnormal heart arrhythmia, it will shock them straight away.
Yeah,
just because they're at an elevated risk. It's just looking at saving life, really.
Yeah, no, it's marvellous. Do you think if there was something like that when Fabrice was around, I know that's quite a while ago, he could have prolonged his playing career?
Potentially, but then the difficulty is, how do you know who to put it into?
Yeah.
Because if he's all clear on the screen, and then there'd be no reason to implant something like that.
Yeah.
So if he was all clear in all the cardiac screening, then he wouldn't have had it anyway.
Yeah. Okay, cool. No, great stuff. And I guess that kind of leads us nicely on to, which I think is probably one of the most mysterious things in football, which is the football medical.
All right, yeah.
So, I mean, like we've already discussed, there's so many things that can be picked up. But I think people, you know, I call myself an armchair fan because I am, but when you see a medical, you just see somebody laying down on a bed with the heart monitors on, giving the thumbs up.
Yeah.
There's pretty much as we know from a medical, but what are the mechanics of it?
So a medical is essentially a risk assessment, and different clubs give different levels of power to the medical team in the medical. So generally, the way that I've seen it is the medical team give a risk assessment for the player that gets relayed to the manager and the directors, and based off that, they can amend a contract or potentially decide not to sign a player because he's not deemed to be financially sensible for X amount of years. And so for us, I've never seen a physio sort of say, no, you're not signing him because it's not sensible, regardless what has happened in their past medical history.
Okay. Yeah.
But I know that I think Milan's medical team have an incredible amount of power over medical signing. So if they say no, then it's no, and that's that. Whereas with us, we just go through. So we'll go through all of their joints. We'll do joint screening, and hip, knee, ankles, and this is. I would think that in the grand scheme of things, Colchester isn't the biggest club, but I think we're quite in depth in our medicals, whilst understanding the scope that we have.
Yeah.
So we'll manually test hip, knees, ankles. If they're goalkeepers, we'll test shoulders. We will have a postural assessment and go through everything to, like, when they're standing, we'll go through how their shoulder sits, what their back is like, how their hips sit, if there's any sort of abnormalities, hips, knees, ankles, feet, how their feet sit, if there's flat-footed, not flat-footed, or if one shoulder's elevated slightly over the other shoulder, if there's any sort of kyphosis, scoliosis, if their patella sits slightly higher than the other side. We go through sort of a whole plethora of tests just to see how they are at baseline and how their body naturally sits. We will test ranges of motion again at loads of different joints in loads of different positions just to see what their body naturally does.
Mm-hmm.
The really, really important part of the medical is understanding what their health has been like in the past. So it's a lot easier when a player comes from another professional club.
Yeah, you've got that documentation of it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We have everything that they've done in the past. Every time they've been in the physio room for X amount of days, if it's an illness or if it's an injury or whatever that might be. And that can tell us what to have a look at a little bit further. So if they've had a hamstring tear and it's quite a bad one, then we're looking at assessing that further because we need to understand the depths of it. We need to understand if we were never at that rehab. So we're aware that everything that's said to us has just been said.
Yeah.
We need to make sure of what we're hearing, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
And following that, we'll do strength tests and jump tests and hop tests and, look at sort of limb symmetries and bits like that. And cardiac screening and a concussion baseline. And I think, to me, that's the most basic level a medical should be.
Yeah.
Then you have clubs that have a bigger budget. Like when Colchester sold Junior Chamadou to Stoke.
Mm-hmm.
They asked for an MRI for every joint in his lower limb and his lumbar spine, which is 7 MRIs.
Right.
Now, for 7 MRIs to be done back to back, Junior would need to be in the MRI machine for a minimum of about 2 hours.
Right, okay.
And that is, you've sort of taken that medical team that does the MRIs, you've taken 7 slots, We wouldn't do that because that we unfortunately, we and probably most other League 2 clubs don't have the facilities to do that. And the other thing with doing that is you can almost scan somebody and find something that actually isn't very relevant.
Right, okay. Yeah.
So
over-analysis.
Exactly. So he can be completely fine, but you can find a little bit of degeneration, for example, in his lumbar spine, but he could be absolutely fine.
Mm-hmm.
And then the physio team, right or wrongly, will sort of delve deeper into it and have a look a bit more. And I think that's when, again, rightly or wrongly, there can be a little bit of bias. So the medical team can sort of say, well, he's got, this wrong with him, and we maybe in the future that might present an issue, but at the minute it's not.
Yeah.
See what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And that's, I think, where difficulty lies when previous clubs or players who don't have a great previous history don't tell the truth. So there have been instances where a club misses something out, or a player misses something out, or tries to bend it a little bit.
Yeah.
And we find out completely based on clinical judgment because things don't 100% line up, or because the medical team said something and the player said something else. And so we tend to find things out slightly that are like, hold on a second, because something isn't quite sitting right here.
Mm-hmm.
And then we will gather all of that information together, all the tests that we've done, the previous medical history, the strength testing, the limb symmetries, the hip quad ratios, and loads of sort of different bits. And we would sort of go through it all and say, okay, in the next 3 or 4 years, there's probably a medium risk that this player will break down for a long amount of time because of 1, 2, 3. Or we could say, actually, this is a relatively clean injury history. The player's quite robust. He's been playing consistently. He hasn't had like a dip in minutes. He's been a robust player, an engine, and you know, he hasn't really had many issues. And that's a low risk player.
Mm-hmm.
The directors will then take what we say on board and they'll say, okay, if he's a high risk player, for example, they might say, okay, well, instead of offering him a 2-year, we might offer him a year with an option.
Yeah.
Or instead of offering him X amount in wages a week, we can offer him less and give him a appearance bonus. That way, if he doesn't play because of injury, the club saves the money on his wages because he hasn't been available. So there's a lot of different ways around sort of how the contract can be amended based on the way that the medical goes. But essentially, it is just a risk assessment.
Yeah, that's similar to what Andy Carroll had at is it Reading? I think it was at Reading where he had that pay as you play, and I think even at West Ham in his last year, he just had they couldn't risk it.
Yeah.
And again, I'm coming back to using West Ham, but they seem to have signed a few crocked ones, like talking at Jack Wilshere as well, players like that, where obviously exceptional talents, but
just a massive risk.
Yeah, the risk on. I mean, because everybody.
And I think for them, and you know, I mentioned Stoke a little bit earlier. For them, it's really different because the amounts that they pay a week for their players are miles beyond what we would pay, you know, for our players, and that's just the reality of football. So for them to make such a massive investment on a player, they probably need to spend that much money to get a better idea of that risk assessment. And so regardless of the detail that you have, it can just help paint that picture a little bit more. Because if they end up missing 9 months because of an ACL, 9 months is what, 36, well, it's going to way more than 36 weeks.
Yeah.
And every week, if you're paying them 20 grand, do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's all of that money. He's a professional rehabber.
Yeah, I suppose it's chicken feed in the grand scheme of a long-term contract.
Yeah.
And coming back again, using Junior as an example there, was it an undisclosed fee or?
Yeah, undisclosed.
Okay, so I won't ask how much it was, but if it gets to the point of any transfer with any player that and they can pick up something even slight, I guess that's just an extra negotiation bargaining tip, even just on the fee itself as well as the player wages.
Do you mean before they join us?
Yeah. So if, like, for example, if I won't use your club as an example, but if Chelsea were going to buy a player for 20 million, but they did so much analysis that they picked something up, they might say, well, we're only going to pay 15 because of something we found in the medical.
100%. Yeah, 100%. And sometimes clubs can go for injured players. Clubs that are players that are actually injured in a minute. Yeah. It's a little bit of a bargaining fee.
Right. Okay.
If they have trust that that player will come back and, you know, and that involves a lot of trust in the medical team as well. That they're going to be able to pick up this injury and bring him back to how he was playing pre-injury.
Yeah.
And there are players that have been signed with. I've seen players signed through ACL injuries. I've seen players signed through ankle sprain injuries. So it's not uncommon to pick a player up while he's actually injured because it gives a little bit of bargaining power.
Yeah. Yeah. I suppose if you're a newly promoted club and, you know, that's how you're going to get this potential star player, and there's always a gamble, I guess, and then there's the pros and cons there.
It's always a gamble. Even in the risk assessment, you know, like ultimately it's impossible to say in the next 3 years, this person is at a 40% risk of picking up an injury.
Yeah.
Because he could get absolutely smashed in the first game.
Yeah.
Could be out for.
Even a fit player, yeah, it could be anyone.
So it's really, really difficult to say. The other bits are you can never really imagine the turbulence in football. Mm-hmm. You know, managers going and managers coming in and the staff that they bring alongside them and the strength and conditioning coaches and how the managers differ in their weekly structures. And all of that has a part to play in how an athlete's player adapts. And if he's having to adapt constantly, differently, every adaptation is just at a bit more of a risk because it changes the way that his body's used to managing that week. So as much as we give a risk assessment, it's still very, very difficult to predict injuries. Yeah. But we will always try our best to prevent them.
Yeah. And I guess coming back to the transfer deadline day, when you're talking about medicals, you always think, like, again, when you're watching Sky Sports and it used to be Jim, it's not Jim anymore, but whoever is on Sky Sports, you're always thinking it's the player, the manager, and the agent that's up till midnight. The medical team's got to be part of that. Isn't it?
We're there, yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say, again, the unsung heroes of those kind of transfers, because you're always so focused on the player and getting the deal done, and typically it's usually you think the agent that holds that up, but I guess in your experience,
we get moaned that.
I was going to say,
get moaned that for the length of medicals. Yeah, we get moaned that.
So and how late in the day sometimes do you get that notice that a player might be coming in?
It can be quite late. I think the latest I've had is maybe 8, but no, I haven't had later than 8 p.m. at a minute.
Yeah.
But so sometimes it can be that actually it's quite early, but the announcement gets made a lot later.
Yeah.
But yeah, realistically, you can be there till it's done.
Yeah. How long does the medical take generally?
With us, if we're going for a full medical, it would if it was someone on their own, probably just over 2 hours.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. That's without the cardiac screening, and that's without sort of the jump tests and the hop tests and a bit like that. So if we're going through the whole thing, it's a staff of people. It's not just going to be one person. So you're looking at actually closer to 3 hours, and then the cardiac screening is another bit, which is a test in and of itself. And then if they need to go for MRIs for anything, then that's another bit in and of itself. So actually, it can actually take plenty of time. But generally, if all of those bits are already done, so if they've had cardiac screening at some point in the last 2 years, then we're happy to take that on and sort of go ahead straight away. But yeah, generally it's around 2 hours for our bit, and then the add-ons after that would be sort of jumps and cardiac screening and bits like that.
Yeah. And how long, just in terms of like where it's done, is it done at the club or is it done at a private medical facility?
No, so everything we can do at a club, we'll do at the club. So all the bits that we can do, the bits that will be done outside are like the MRIs, the cardiac screening.
Yeah.
That's pretty much it.
Cool. Great stuff. And just lastly, thanks for all those insights. I guess lastly, I'm just keen to hear, I know you do some work with sort of outside of football yourself, obviously coming from Iraq and the Iraq Football Club. I see you do did a post with it recently. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Yeah,
so I think generally coming from maybe a background that's a lot less common, especially in Essex, I think football there is a lot less developed than it is here. And there's not a lot of Arabs in general that work in football in the UK. And with it being regarded generally as the highest sort of standard of football in the world, there's a lot that we can take from here to help our countries and our leagues develop in the right way, to bring better players out and to sort of put the nation on the map and to get into the World Cups and to, achieve more international success. And I think it's sort of really difficult to do that straight away. And it needs to start with the community, and the community needs to be aware of it first, because there's a lot of hidden talent in our communities.
Yeah.
And as soon as we start identifying hidden talents, and then people start to pick up on it, and then their names start to sort of get bigger, and you start to see success stories, and then it's almost like building traction. And I hope he won't mind it, but Iraq Football Club is essentially it's almost a community charity team. And it's done, the things that they would participate in are for charity. So participating in a inner city World Cup over the summer was solely done for charity, and they do sort of all other sorts of events and bits like that. But essentially it's about bringing talent that's hidden in the community and showcasing it. And the inner city World Cup is an example of that, where scouts can sort of come from all over the country to see these common Sunday League footballers showcase their talent. And thankfully, sort of off the back of that, we have had one of our players head over to Iraq to sign a professional deal, and he's signed for a club in their Premier League. But that's just sort of one really small success story. Ultimately, I think one of my goals is to help the league back home develop, and him signing there is almost like a gateway into that, you know, knowing someone in Iraqi football or knowing an Iraqi sort of national star to help have that bridge across. And as far as I'm aware, a lot of the first team staff in the Iraqi national team actually come from La Liga. So Jesus Casas is a coach who has worked most of his life in La Liga. And the Iraqi Premier League is now becoming sponsored by La Liga, and they're sort of offering more and more bits and coaching and bits like that. But from a medical perspective, it's so low. So low. It's probably less than non-league.
Right, okay.
And so I think it's such a important part to develop to make sure that the Iraqi player has more longevity, is safer, has a better established career, that when they have an injury, they can return back stronger, to set a proper medical and sports science program to have loading and prevention and conditioning all planned out in a way that the players become proper athletes, not just a footballer, you know?
Yeah.
And that's something they really, really lack. So I think ultimately that's the long-term goal.
Yeah. So I think like any nation that really wants to improve, they just focus on coaching, and they don't really focus on the athlete. That, as you kind of said there, is just about that.
Yeah, I think ultimately we're really, really lucky here that the FA has so much input into, especially in the academies, that you've got to have this and you've got to have that, and there are rules. And if you don't follow those rules, you're not going to be that level of academy anymore, because they will audit you, and if you don't pass, then they drop your academy status. Other FAs don't have that. Other countries don't have that level of input from their football association. They just predominantly care about the Premier League, and that is it. Yeah.
Awesome. Hashim, thank you very much for coming in. Really problem. Appreciate it. Problem. I think there's a hell of a lot of really good insights there. So thank you for sharing.
No problem. Really, really glad to do it, actually.
Great stuff. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Cheers.